So what's been your first reaction to this latest wave of protests, and how would you compare it to what you've seen during other times? For example, mobilizations during the Civil Rights era, the LA Uprising, and more recently, Ferguson, Baltimore, and Black Lives Matter about 5 years ago.
Well, one thing that's significant and very, very important is the international solidarity that's being expressed worldwide. I think people are recognizing that the struggle within the US is a struggle that impacts everyone because, of course, we are at the center of empire. And it's also important, too, that people understand, and I think that they do, that this fight is not just a fight for justice for George Floyd, but it is a fight that is bringing attention to the ongoing human rights crisis within the US and the ongoing war being waged against Black and brown working class people in this country. So the connections between the struggles in the US and the solidarity of people around the world does signal a very, very important departure and one that does harken back to the days of the 1960s, when the struggles of African people in the US was the centerpiece of resistance for many.
Now, as these protests are accompanied by discussions of police brutality and the historical racism of U.S. law enforcement and the state, do you think people are also beginning to see the way in which these issues tie in with capitalism? And are young people able to see this with a class analysis?
That understanding is beginning to develop. People are beginning to make the pivot away from the notion of George Floyd being a one-off situation to one that is can only be understood within the context of the role of the police force as the cutting edge of enforcement for the capitalist state. They are also making the connection between the death of George Floyd and the hundreds of African American people who are dying every day from capitalism. We call it it's called COVID-19. We call it the colonial virus. And so people are making those connections and understanding that even after the George Floyd situation is resolved, that the deaths and the structural violence that people are exposed to, as long as we have capitalism, will continue. So those connections are being made. And that's why this fight in the US is not going away anytime soon.
So you yourself are an organizer. What would you say about the organizational structures of these protests, or the lack thereof, or the potential for a more militant and concerted direction with these mobilizations?
Well, people are starting to make the pivot to to organization. I think everybody recognizes the importance of mobilizations, but also recognize the limitations. So there will be a greater and more deeper organization coming out of these activities. In the Black Alliance for Peace, we are advancing our campaign, No Compromise, No Retreat, defeat the war against the African working class and poor in the US and abroad. So we are making the connections between the absolute necessity to fight capitalism, to make the connection between militarism in the US and militarism on the African continent, to raise up in opposition to the sanctions being imposed on peoples and states across the planet. We are raising issues with the US budget and the prospects of nuclear war. So we are making those connections and trying to get across to our people the message that through organization and through envisioning, we in fact can win.
So speaking of Black Alliance for Peace, you're calling for the UN to address this human rights crisis in the United States. Tell us about that, and what would it take to hear from international bodies and foreign governments on the deterioration of democracy in the United States as the regime is killing its own people, targeting journalists, and mobilizing militarized forces to repress citizens?
Well, one reason why we made that appeal was the comment made by President Trump, where he basically said that the U.S. state was prepared to use lethal force against African Americans and others who may be engaged in lawful activities. And so we called on the UN to, in fact, intervene to protect the human rights of people in the U.S. We know that the U.S. has used this weapon of human rights as a justification for interventions, unilateral interventions. But we know that one of the central elements of the United Nations mission is to protect human rights. So we say if there's going to be a scrutiny and intervention in countries around the world, that same standard should be applied for the United States of America, where we have this ongoing and deepening human rights crisis. We made that call, but we recognize that in the end, it is only the organized people of this country that are going to be able to objectively protect our human rights. We understand we have to fight for our human rights, and we are preparing to do just that.
So the U.S. capitalist class is responsible for generations of flagrant looting upon which the country was founded. What do you say to the media and those operatives who have tagged working class citizens as looters and violent rioters while most of us are getting ransacked?
Well, we say that basically the real looting is taking place by the capitalist class. And one of the most brazen examples of that was the legislation that was meant to bail out the economy, but what really ended up being a bailout for the bankers and the corporations to the tune of billions of dollars. So that is the significant looting that we're concerned with. We're not concerned with some minor looting of some stores or some minor property damage in the course of people involved in struggle. And we are hoping that people don't get too confused by the attempts by the corporate press to focus on the looting in order to try to demoralize the movement and confuse people in terms of what the objectives are in this country. So we're not concerned about looting. We understand what we need to do to build a movement, and we understand that we have the values and the prestige to engage in a struggle that will win millions to our side.
This Rise Up to Shut Down AFRICOM call and campaign that Black Alliance for Peace has been making resonates here in South America, in Ecuador and Venezuela, which borders Colombia, from which the United States has launched paramilitary and military aggressions against Venezuela. Help us make that connection between the hyper-militarization of the streets in the United States and those military operations abroad.
We say basically that the U.S. military activity in the form of police repression in the U.S. is only the domestic side of the imperialist coin. The other side, of course, is the militarism and warmongering that we see the U.S. empire engaged in globally. So we are very much concerned about the expansion of some of those repressive structures like NATO, attempting to expand even into Latin America. We're concerned about the fact that there is a brigade of U.S. Military personnel being deployed to Colombia on the border, allegedly to assist with anti-drug activity. But we know that they are militarizing their border in order to be more effective in their interventions into Venezuela. So we are opposing that activity and attempting to educate people in the U.S. on the fact that real solidarity requires that we stand with the people of Venezuela. We reject NATO expansion in Latin America, that we stand with the people in Brazil who are struggling for a real democracy, that we reject the expansion of AFRICOM on the Africa continent. So we are making those links because we see ourselves as a colonized people who have a fundamental connection to and common interest with the colonized people of the world who are fighting to rid the world of this pan-European, white supremacist, colonial, capitalist patriarchy that's been ruling the world for the last 500 in 25 years or so.
And just a final question, Ajamu. Before these protests and the coronavirus, the country was focused on the primaries. Give us your thoughts on how what has now taken place since March and what we're seeing today will affect the presidential race. And if I can add, what should all of those Bernie Sanders supporting young people do next?
But we're hoping that those Bernie Sanders young people are in the streets, are standing shoulder to shoulder with the African Americans and others who are fighting against capitalist oppression. And that is probably what's going to happen when it comes to November also. That people are really beginning to question this whole line of the Trump administration represents some existential threat that means we only should elect a Democrat in the form of Biden. But we say, while we understand the kind of forces that Trump represents, we also understand that it is the neoliberal right that is in control of the U.S. state, and that it is the neoliberal right that is involved in strengthening the repressive apparatus of the U.S. state. So we don't see a fundamental difference between the two. We understand that our struggle, our fight, goes beyond just the electoral cycles. And so we are preparing our people for the protracted nature of that fight. So what happens in November, we say the day after the election for African people in the US, we say nothing changes. Our fight continues. And indeed, the fight continues for all of the working class and the people of the world.
Ajamu Baraka, national organizer for Black Alliance for Peace. Thank you so much for being with us.
My pleasure. Thank you.